My name is Lila Bennett. I'm 32 years old, and my father's funeral was the most humiliating and the most revealing day of my life. It started the moment I stepped out of my car. The engine had coughed its way up the hill to the chapel, struggling like it always does on cold mornings. The parking lot was already full, lined with polished SUVs and sleek sedans that reflected the soft winter sun. I tucked the loose end of my coat under my arm and kept my head down, walking briskly past cars I recognized from family parties I'd stopped getting invited to years ago. The chapel was beautiful. Dad had loved it here, the old wooden pews, the quiet light that filtered in through stained glass. I chose a seat in the back, near the aisle, where I wouldn't be noticed. I wore a plain black dress I'd borrowed from a friend. The shoes were mine, scuffed at the toes, the kind you can't return even if you keep the receipt because they came from a thrift store clearance rack. Then she arrived, Harper. She swept into the chapel like a scene from a movie. Black cashmere dress, designer sunglasses perched on her head like a crown, arm in arm with her husband, Jonathan. Her heels echoed down the aisle, and all eyes followed. Our extended family trailed behind her like loyal subjects. There was a murmur of admiration. I could almost hear the silent comparisons. They didn't have to say anything out loud. They never did. Harper always knew how to walk into a room and make me feel like I didn't belong in it. She spotted me almost instantly. Her mouth curled into a tight little smile, one she saved just for me. She leaned in close as she passed, whispering loud enough for the entire row to hear. "You really should have stayed home." She said it like it was a kindness, like she was offering me mercy. But there was no mercy in her voice, just the same sharp cruelty she'd wielded since we were girls. The kind that cuts without raising its volume. She didn't even need to look back to know it would land. A few people laughed quietly, pretending they hadn't heard. I didn't respond. I sat there, staring straight ahead. My hands clasped tightly in my lap, my palms were damp, my stomach was hollow, the kind of hollow that comes not just from grief, but from remembering that even on the day we laid our father to rest, Harper still needed to win. She had everything: money, respect, Dad's favor for most of our lives. She was the one he trusted with the business, the one who hosted family dinners in her 6-bedroom home, while I was trying to scrape together rent from 2 part-time jobs and a freelance gig that barely paid. She was always the daughter who had it together, while I was the one who took the long way or just needed time to find herself. That's how they put it nicely. What they really meant was, Harper was the one who mattered. I didn't cry during the service. Not because I wasn't mourning, I was, but grief is complicated when it's tangled with betrayal. You don't just lose the person, they take pieces of your history with them. I sat in that pew, listening to the eulogies, the hymns, the carefully rehearsed stories, and I thought about the last time I saw my father alive. It was a week before he died. He asked me to visit him alone. He was thinner than I'd ever seen him, pale and tired. But his eyes were sharp that day, sharper than they'd been in years. He took my hand and asked if I remembered the time he forgot to pick me up from piano lessons when I was 11. He said he thought about that day more than I knew, said it haunted him. I didn't understand why he brought it up until he said he had something to tell me, something he'd never told anyone. He told me he was wrong about a lot of things. About Harper, about me. He said he let himself be manipulated by the daughter who knew how to please him, flatter him, control him. And he said he saw now who had stayed close out of love and who had shown up out of strategy. He said he regretted not seeing me, really seeing me, until it was too late. He asked me to promise I would come to the funeral, no matter what, that I would attend the reading of his will, that I would wait, even if it hurt. So I waited. I waited while Harper laughed at my shoes, while her friends whispered about my car, while everyone pretended not to notice the distance between our rows. I waited through the prayers and the tears and the final song, because I knew something she didn't. A week after the funeral, I walked into my father's lawyer's office feeling like a ghost in someone else's life, the kind of life where people wore tailored suits and called each other by their full names, the kind of life Harper was born into, and I was born next to. I sat in the waiting room and tried not to fidget, smoothing the skirt of my black dress with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Harper arrived 15 minutes late. She entered like she always did, high heels, designer bag swinging at her side, perfume clouding the air in her wake. Jonathan followed, silent and watchful, and then came the rest: cousins, uncles, her small entourage of family and advisors. all here to witness what Harper had no doubt already told them would be her formal crowning. She glanced at me, smiled, like she pitied me, and sat down across the room without a word. When we were kids, we used to play house. She always made me be the maid if I complained. She'd run to Dad and tell him I was being difficult. I was 5, she was 7. That was the beginning of it. The rehearsals for the roles we'd go on to play for the next 2 decades. I was the disappointment. She was the heir daughter, so she thought. The lawyer, Mr. Denham, was old school, stoic, gray-haired, and deeply uncomfortable with emotion. He shuffled papers, cleared his throat, and gave the usual preamble about the legal weight of a last will and testament. Harper leaned back in her seat, legs crossed, tapping one polished nail against the armrest like she already knew everything he was about to say. She didn't. I didn't even flinch when he said my name first. To my daughter, Lila Jane Bennett, he began, reading from a thick, bound document. I leave the primary residence at 118 Maple Lane. There was a pause in the room, a slight tilt of heads, a shared confusion. Harper didn't move. To Lila, I also leave 70% ownership of Bennett & Co., as well as sole decision-making authority as outlined in the revised partnership agreement, dated March 4th. I heard someone gasp. Maybe me, maybe someone else. I was too busy watching Harper. Her foot stopped tapping. 70%. He hadn't just given me more than her. He'd handed me control. Of the house, of the business, of the very things Harper had spent her life curating, polishing, building not just for profit, but for pride, for power. To Harper Elise Bennett, the lawyer said next, adjusting his glasses. I leave the contents of safety deposit box 214 at First National Bank. Her mouth twitched, curling upward again. A final reward, no doubt, the real treasure, tucked away, the part Dad hadn't wanted read aloud. And the letter enclosed within. The room stilled. Mr. Denham pulled out a single envelope, sealed, and addressed in my father's handwriting. Harper snatched it from his hand, her cheeks flushing a sharp red. She didn't open it right away. Maybe she wanted to wait, to savor it. Maybe she already thought she'd won something I hadn't. But I'd seen the look on the lawyer's face, and I knew. The silence in the room wasn't confusion anymore. It was shift. He cleared his throat once more. That concludes the reading. Harper stood. She didn't say anything to me. She didn't have to. The silence between us had always been full of accusations. But this time, I didn't look away. She was holding that envelope like it might burn her. She walked out quickly, head high, but I saw that flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, and I stayed seated. Everyone else filed out slowly, murmuring, whispering behind their hands. I was still holding the armrest. Fingers white-knuckled, barely breathing. I hadn't known what Dad was going to do, not exactly. I knew he'd changed something. I didn't know he'd changed everything. I sat in that chair long after the room emptied. I thought about our last conversation again. How his voice had trembled when he said, "This time, the right daughter gets the chance." I think part of me had believed he'd change his mind, that he'd die like he lived, half blind to the damage Harper had done, too guilty to fix what had broken between us. But he hadn't. He saw me, finally, fully. And now it was mine. All of it. The house she lived in, the business she ran, the legacy she thought was hers by right. Harper had mocked my grief. But she never understood the strength in staying quiet. The power in waiting, the cost of loving someone who didn't love you the way they should and doing it anyway. Now she was the one on the outside, and I had only just begun. The first thing I did was change the locks. It felt petty, I'll admit that, but there was something oddly satisfying about the metallic click of the new key turning in the front door of a house Harper used to treat like her private showroom. I stood in the entryway, staring at the familiar hallway, the polished wood floors, the framed photos of smiling faces who had long since taken sides. Everything still smelled like his cologne, a blend of cedarwood and something darker, something warm. The smell of childhood memories I had to claw my way back to. I hadn't lived here since I was 19. Harper had seen to that. Back then, I'd left after another one of our explosive fights, something about Dad's birthday dinner, and how I hadn't RSVP'd fast enough for her taste. But the truth ran deeper. She'd always made sure I knew. I was extra, a leftover, a responsibility our father never asked for. I remember her calling me a mistake once, when she thought I couldn't hear. I was 14. She was already cruel with purpose, and yet, Dad had let her have the run of this house, of the company, of our entire narrative. Until now, the next morning, I drove to the office. My name had already been added to the ownership documents, and I held the majority vote. That was the kind of shift that changed conversations in hallways. People made eye contact with me for the first time in years. One man even held the door open with a tight, polite smile, like I'd just been promoted instead of dragged back into a legacy I never asked for. I found Harper's office door shut. Her nameplate was still there, Harper Bennett, Vice President. There was no president plaque anymore. That one had been taken down years ago after our father retired, supposedly to leave the business in capable hands. Harper's hands. The receptionist looked uncomfortable when I asked her to inform Harper that I'd arrived. I waited by the window, watching cars pass on the street below. 30 minutes passed. No response. Finally, I knocked once and walked in. She was sitting at the desk, scrolling on her phone, a smirk already forming like it had never left. Did you make an appointment? I didn't answer. I sat down across from her. Here to gloat? She asked, raising an eyebrow. No, I said quietly. I'm here to start doing the job Dad left me to do. She laughed. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It was the kind of laugh that said you'll never win because you still think this is a game. Sweetheart, she said, this place doesn't run on ownership, it runs on control. And I've had that for 10 years. She wasn't wrong. Harper had embedded herself so deeply into the roots of this company that even the walls seemed to lean in when she walked by. She'd built relationships, manipulated loyalty, and twisted the narrative so expertly that even the people she'd hurt would smile at her in the hallway. But she had made one mistake. One she didn't even realize. She underestimated how well I'd been watching from the shadows. I didn't storm out of the room. I didn't argue. I stood, nodded once, and left. Then I started digging. I went through the financials, quietly, carefully. I reviewed emails, contracts, bonus structures that didn't make sense, vendor lists that seemed too long. I started meeting employees one by one, real people who were scared to speak at first, but once they saw my name on the documents and heard the steadiness in my voice, they started talking. I learned how Harper had used Dad's declining health to reroute money into marketing projects that never existed, how she'd bullied junior staff into silence, how she'd cut deals with suppliers that personally benefited her husband's firm, how she'd hired friends, fired critics, and slowly turned a family company into her own private empire. And I kept receipts, every single one, not for revenge in the way people imagine it. I didn't want to humiliate her the way she had humiliated me. That would have been too easy, too much like her. No, I wanted her to feel the one thing she'd never had to feel before. Powerless. Because revenge, to me, wasn't about watching her fall. It was about rising in the space she never thought I was worthy of. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was standing outside my own story anymore. I was inside it. And I was writing the next chapter. The first week back in the office felt like walking barefoot through glass. Everyone smiled a little too much, or not at all. Conversations dropped when I entered a room. People didn't know what to do with me. The forgotten daughter who suddenly had the keys to the kingdom. I didn't blame them. They'd been trained to orbit Harper for years. She'd been the sun in their small galaxy, bright, commanding, untouchable. Now she was a shadow, still large, still looming, but shrinking. I didn't charge in with speeches or big promises. I just started showing up, on time, every day, without excuse. I walked the floors, asked questions no one had bothered to ask in years. I sat in on meetings she used to delegate and made a point to listen more than I spoke. At first, they treated me like I was temporary, a phase, a glitch in Harper's otherwise flawless takeover. But people started noticing. I remembered names. I followed up. I asked about families, kids, sick parents, the small things Harper never had the patience for. She ruled by intimidation, by fear disguised as efficiency. I wasn't her. I didn't want to be. But I was also no longer afraid of her. There was one woman, Martina, who had been with the company since we were teenagers. She handled payroll and HR. And she'd always been kind to me in the quiet ways, slipping me extra mints at the front desk, saying happy birthday when no one else remembered. When I asked her to join me for lunch in the break room one afternoon, her eyes widened like I'd asked her to fly to the moon. We sat at the sticky table with paper napkins and vending machine coffee. I asked her a simple question. What's the one thing you'd change here? If you could, She stared at me for a long moment, then said, "I'd start by letting people feel safe again." That stuck with me. Safe. Not profitable, not dominant, not efficient, safe. I went home that night to a house full of boxes and silence, and I thought about how long it had been since I felt safe anywhere, not in my family, not in the business. Not even in my own skin. Harper had built a kingdom with sharp edges and glass ceilings, but I wasn't interested in ruling from a throne. I wanted to build something with doors that opened and floors that didn't crack under pressure. I knew I couldn't erase what Harper had done, but I could start to undo it. I began reviewing every department, not with the eye of a critic, but with the eye of someone looking for rot beneath the floorboards. I started attending staff meetings Harper never bothered with, catching moments where people felt brave enough to speak truth. I promoted someone from accounting after watching her quietly correct a senior exec's mistake without demanding credit. I redirected a marketing budget to an overworked logistics team who hadn't gotten a bonus in 3 years. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't make headlines, but slowly, the temperature shifted. The hush when I entered a room turned into nods, then small smiles, then questions. And Harper noticed. She wasn't subtle about it. She started showing up earlier, louder. She wore brighter lipstick, held longer meetings, sent company-wide emails signed with her full name in bold font, like she was reminding everyone who still mattered. But the difference now was, I didn't flinch. The board requested a quarterly review. I prepared the presentation myself. Without consultants or fluff, just numbers, truth, progress. I told them where the money had been going, and how we were going to change that. I didn't throw Harper under the bus. Not yet, but I planted seeds of doubt, of questions, of accountability. After the meeting, one of the board members pulled me aside. He was in his 60s, close to retirement, and he'd always been one of Harper's quiet allies. "You've got your father's eyes," he said, "but you don't have his blind spots." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. Later that week, I passed by Harper's office. The door was open, but she didn't look up. She just sat there, staring at something on her screen, her jaw tight. Her hand clenched around her stylus like it was the last thing she could control. She knew something was changing. She just didn't know how deep the shift went. And that was the beauty of it. I wasn't taking her power. I was reclaiming mine. The first article came out 3 weeks after the quarterly review. It was buried in the business section of a local paper, just a small feature about leadership transitions and fresh vision at Bennett & Co. I found it by accident, scrolling on my lunch break with a lukewarm sandwich in my lap and a dozen unanswered emails blinking at the edge of my screen. There was a photo attached, me, standing outside the main office in a navy blazer that still had the price tag hidden inside the sleeve. I looked startled, like I wasn't quite sure how I'd ended up there, but I didn't hate the photo. For the first time, I saw someone who looked steady. It shouldn't have mattered. It was just a small piece, a quiet ripple, but I knew Harper would see it. I waited for her storm, but it didn't come right away. She didn't mention the article. She didn't acknowledge the attention shifting around us like dust in a sunbeam, but her posture changed, stiffer, shorter conversations, longer silences. She started watching me more than she spoke to me. And the truth was, I didn't need her words anymore. I had my own. I scheduled a staff-wide meeting, the kind of thing she only ever did over email or through a proxy. I stood at the front of the largest conference room, hands trembling behind the podium, wondering if I'd regret this. But then I looked out and saw them. Real people, tired people. People who'd worked under Harper for years and had learned to keep their heads down, their mouths shut, their opinions safe. "I won't pretend to have all the answers," I said. "But I can promise you this, we're going to start listening. Again, actually listening. And if I fall short, I want to hear about it." It was quiet at first, just polite claps. But after the meeting, something shifted. A woman from customer accounts came up and thanked me, not for what I said, for being there at all. That night, I lay awake in my father's old house, staring at the ceiling fan, trying to remember the last time I felt like I belonged anywhere. I thought about how Harper used to make fun of my voice when we were kids, said I sounded too soft, too unsure, but maybe it wasn't weakness, maybe it was room, maybe softness gave people space to speak. 2 days later, a podcast reached out. A local business series looking to highlight women in leadership. I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. I told my story with care, not the messy details of family betrayal, but the parts I could share with honesty, the slow rise, the late chance. The lesson that leadership doesn't have to be loud to be strong. It spread faster than I expected, not viral, but visible, and Harper noticed. She stormed into my office the following Monday, her heels stabbing the tile like accusations. "You're playing games," she said. I didn't even look up from my computer. "No, I'm leading." Her laugh was sharp, brittle. "You think people care about podcasts and press blurbs? This company runs on deals, not sympathy." "I'm not looking for sympathy," I said. "I'm building trust." She didn't know what to do with that. Trust wasn't a language she spoke fluently. The board called me in again. This time, they asked about expansion plans, ESG policies, long-term restructuring. They used phrases like new direction and strategic evolution. They listened when I spoke. Harper was still technically the vice president, but she looked smaller every time I saw her in the hallway. She wore brighter clothes, made louder phone calls, gave longer speeches in shorter meetings, but the attention was shifting, not because I was louder, but because I was real. People are hungry for something genuine, especially in places that have been built on performance for too long. And that's what Harper never understood. She thought power came from control. But sometimes, power grows in silence, in listening, in showing up, in not needing to prove anything anymore. That's what I was becoming. Not a copy of her. Something entirely different. And people were beginning to see it. I didn't start with the worst of it. That would have been too obvious, too loud, and Harper was too smart for loud. She'd built her empire on subtlety, on moves made behind closed doors, on smiles that hid knives. If I wanted to undo what she'd spent a decade fortifying, I'd have to use her own weapons. Just sharper. So I started small. I called an old friend of Dad's, Russell Green, a retired accountant who used to work with the company before Harper convinced Dad to modernize with her own team. I met him for coffee, brought along a printed report I'd quietly compiled over the past month, vendor discrepancies, misfiled bonuses. 3 separate shell LLCs that funneled contracts through her husband's consulting firm. Russell didn't say much while I talked. He just sipped his coffee and nodded, eyes narrowing as he turned pages. At the end, he said, "You've got something here, but it needs teeth." Teeth, that's what I didn't have yet. Just documents, suspicion, patterns that formed a shadow, but not yet a shape. So I kept digging. I called past employees who'd been let go without reason, people who had left with severance packages and non-disclosure agreements, too scared or too tired to speak up. But when I introduced myself as the majority shareholder and reminded them Harper no longer had final say, the tone changed. One by one, the stories came out. A manager demoted after questioning Harper's expense reports. A vendor forced to use Harper's preferred courier service at a 30% markup. A junior accountant who uncovered duplicate payments and was asked to resign for poor performance. I didn't need a smoking gun. I had a trail of embers, and so I did the next thing Harper would never expect. I went to legal. I didn't accuse. I asked questions, quietly, carefully. I requested internal audits. I reviewed old emails with timestamps and flagged signatures. I submitted formal documentation of potential conflicts of interest. I wasn't dramatic about it. I didn't leak it to the board, not yet. I let it stew, because timing was everything. Meanwhile, Harper got louder. She began making executive decisions, without my approval. Sent out a company-wide message that we were exploring a merger with a boutique tech firm, one I'd never even heard of. I asked Jonathan, her husband, about it casually at a shareholder mixer. He choked on his wine, said, "Oh, I didn't know Harper told anyone about that yet." I smiled. The next day, I sent an anonymous tip to a business ethics watchdog group. Not enough to spark a lawsuit, just enough to raise questions, enough to make people curious. And curious people start looking. A reporter called the office 2 weeks later, requesting comment on recent rumors regarding conflicts of interest among executive leadership. I forwarded the message directly to Harper. She showed up at my door less than 10 minutes later. "You think this is funny?" she said, voice shaking. "You think you can smear me just because Dad handed you a bigger slice?" I stood, met her eyes, and spoke calmly. "I'm not smearing you, I'm uncovering you." She stared at me, breathing hard like she couldn't believe I'd said it out loud. "You don't have the stomach for this," she hissed. "I have more than a stomach," I said. I have the truth, and I'm not hiding behind it. I thought she might hit me, but she didn't. She turned and left without slamming the door, which in Harper's world was the equivalent of a scream. That weekend, a small finance blog ran a piece called When Family Fails, The Risks of Nepotism in Business. It didn't name us directly, but it quoted a source close to the leadership team at Bennett & Co., who spoke about unethical procurement practices and a reckoning underway. I printed the article and slid it into a file folder, labeled Documentation. Harper had ruled with fear. I was building something else, something that couldn't be silenced with a smirk or a smear, because I wasn't just watching her fall. I was making sure there was nowhere soft for her to land. It happened late on a Friday. The office had emptied out, rain tapped against the windows in soft, uneven rhythms, and I was the only one left on the floor, finishing a report I didn't need to write. Anything to stay busy. My mind had been restless all week. The investigations were in motion now, the rumors growing teeth. I knew Harper was unraveling, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she came for me. I just didn't expect her to show up in the middle of the storm, soaked to the bone, holding Dad's letter in her shaking hand. I didn't stand when she walked into my office. She didn't sit. You did this, she said, voice low and raw. You planned this, all of it. I looked at her, really looked, mascara smudged beneath her eyes, hair wild from the rain, expensive coat clinging to her like it was trying to hold her together. I didn't plan for him to change the will, I said. That was all him. You're lying. Her voice cracked. He never would have cut me out unless you poisoned him against me. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was exactly the kind of fantasy she needed to tell herself, that I had manipulated our father, that I was capable of what she'd spent years doing with ease. He saw you, I said finally, that's all. She threw the letter onto my desk like it was trash. I didn't reach for it. You read it? I asked. She didn't answer. Just stared at me like I was something foreign, like she was trying to find the version of me she used to know, the quiet one, the one who always backed down. I gave everything to this family, she said, arms trembling, to this company. While you were off playing starving artist, or activist, or whatever it is you told yourself made you better than us. I never thought I was better, I said, just tired of begging to matter. The silence after that was thick, uncomfortable. She looked like she wanted to scream, to throw something. But all she did was sink slowly into the chair across from me. I held this place together when Dad started losing it. She said quietly, I signed contracts, covered for him when he forgot meetings, when he misspoke in front of clients. I saved this company. I nodded, and you bled it, too. Her eyes flashed. Don't pretend you understand what it took. I don't, I said, not entirely, but I know what it cost. Cost me everything, she said, voice suddenly small, and he repaid me by giving it to you. We sat in that stillness, two women grieving a man who had failed them in different ways. One loved too blindly, one wasn't seen at all. He said he regretted it. I murmured, how he treated me. How he let you get away with things because it was easier than facing the truth. Her lip quivered, and for a second, she looked like the girl I grew up with, the one who used to braid my hair and then pull it too tight, the one who read my diary out loud to her friends, then bought me ice cream the next day like it canceled out the cruelty. I didn't think he'd ever stop believing in me, she whispered. And suddenly, I didn't feel victorious, I just felt exhausted. Because this wasn't about the house, or the business, or even the money. It was about a man who raised two daughters to believe love had to be earned, and then gave us both reasons to believe we never had. You could have had me, I said softly, as your partner, your sister, but you only ever saw me as the threat. She didn't reply, just stared at the wall behind me, as if looking at me was too painful. I didn't ask her to stay. I didn't ask her to apologize, I just let her go. When she finally stood and walked out, her heels echoing down the hallway like punctuation marks at the end of a life she no longer owned, I picked up the letter after she left. It was still sealed. I didn't open it. Some things don't need to be read to be understood. Some words say everything just by existing. The courthouse smelled like dust and nerves. Not the dramatic kind you see on TV, no slamming gavels, no shouting lawyers. Just long fluorescent hallways, tight suits, and people pretending this wasn't the worst day of their lives. I sat on the left side of the courtroom, near the back, with a notebook in my lap I never opened. I wasn't called to the stand until the second day, but I showed up every morning on time. Silent. Harper entered like she always did, dressed to control the room, a sharp black suit, hair smooth and pinned back, makeup soft enough to appear honest, but her eyes never changed. They were the same ones that had narrowed across Thanksgiving tables and boardrooms, always calculating, always waiting for weakness. Except now, they looked tired. Her lawyer introduced her as a visionary businesswoman and the true architect of Bennett & Co.'s success. They painted her as a woman wronged, betrayed by a grieving father's confusion, then publicly dismantled by a jealous sister with no corporate experience. It was a good story, clean, sharp, believable, even until the evidence came out. The documents I'd gathered, the shell companies, the emails with attached invoices that couldn't be explained, testimony from former employees, some trembling, others seething. And when it was my turn to speak, I did it slowly, not bitterly, not dramatically, just truthfully. I spoke about the discrepancies I found, about how money moved in circles and how decisions were made behind closed doors that left entire departments underfunded while Harper's husband's firm bloomed overnight. I told them what I'd been told, that when people questioned her, they disappeared, that the culture she built was one of silence, not strength. I didn't mention the letter, or the funeral, or the years of being overlooked. I didn't need to. The facts were enough. Harper didn't look at me once while I spoke. She sat rigid in her chair, hands folded in her lap, lips pressed together like the truth might fall out if she moved too suddenly. The courtroom was cold, and the hours long. But when the judge read the verdict, it was quiet. Guilty. Fraud, misuse of company funds, breach of fiduciary duty, not prison, not yet, anyway, just fines, restrictions, a mandate to sell back her shares and relinquish all titles. But in Harper's world, that was a sentence worse than bars. It was erasure. Afterward, she didn't cry, she didn't scream. She just walked out, past reporters, past cameras, past me. Her heels didn't click with the same confidence anymore. They just moved, one step at a time, like she had nowhere left to go. I stepped outside into a gray afternoon, the wind cold against my skin. Reporters circled like birds. But I didn't speak to them. I had nothing to say that they would understand. This wasn't justice in the cinematic sense. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like release. Because the truth is, I didn't want her to suffer. I wanted her to stop pretending she hadn't caused harm. I wanted the silence between us to finally say something real, and it had, in court documents, in confessions, in the hollow look in her eyes. When the verdict was read, that night, I stood outside the company building alone. I looked up at the sign, Bennett & Co., and wondered if it would ever stop feeling like a house I'd been locked out of for years. Part of me wanted to rip the name down and start over. Part of me wanted to leave it, just as it was, and redefine what it meant. A man I didn't know walked by and nodded toward the building. Rough week, he said. I smiled softly. Long time coming. He kept walking. The street fell quiet, and for the first time in my life, so did I. No voice in my head telling me I wasn't enough. No echo of Harper's laughter. No need to prove myself. Just quiet, and something close to peace. I waited 3 days before I visited his grave, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know what to say. For so long, I'd imagined that moment, standing at the cold stone with Harper behind me, stripped of the power she once wore like armor. I thought it would feel triumphant. I thought it would make everything make sense. But when I got there, it was just quiet. The wind moved through the trees like it was trying to speak for someone. The sky was overcast. The grass had grown in thick around the headstone, soft and uneven. Richard Thomas Bennett, beloved father, husband and founder. That word lingered. I crouched down beside the stone and brushed some leaves away. My fingertips grazed the letters. I wondered if he'd ever thought about this moment. If he imagined that the daughter he'd sidelined for most of her life would be the one kneeling beside his grave, not in mourning, but in aftermath. "Hi, Dad," I said softly. There was no answer. Of course, no grand sense of closure. Just me and the weight of everything he left behind. "I did what you asked," I said. "I went, I stayed, I listened and I waited." The words sat heavy in the air, not bitter, not resentful, just real. "I didn't think you'd actually do it," I admitted. "Change the will, trust me with the company, but you did." I paused, biting the inside of my cheek, and she hated me for it. I looked down at my hands. They still bore the faint stress lines from weeks of tension, courtroom days, long nights with financial audits and memories I couldn't shake. But they were steady now. Stronger, you always said Harper was the strong one, I said, and maybe she was, or maybe she just got good at making everyone believe it. I took a breath. She tried to break me, all my life, with her silence, with her laughter, with the way she never let me forget I was the spare part. The wind shifted. A single leaf skidded across the grass. I think you let her, because it was easier than confronting the truth. You gave her your trust, your business, your attention, and I kept loving you anyway, even when it hurt, even when you didn't see me. I felt my throat tighten, but you saw me at the end, didn't you? That last visit, that letter you left her. My voice cracked then, just a little. You didn't say much, you didn't make some grand apology, but you gave me this chance. You handed me the pieces of a life I never thought I'd have. And I'm not going to waste it. I stood slowly, brushing the grass from my coat. I'm not going to be like her, I said. I'm going to build something better, something honest, something that matters. The clouds broke slightly, a thin band of sunlight slipping through. It touched the corner of the headstone and disappeared again, as fast as it came. I took that as a kind of answer. Before I turned to leave, I rested my hand on the top of the stone. I forgive you, I whispered. Not because you asked, but because I need to. On the walk back to the car, I felt different, not lighter, exactly, just more whole. The ache was still there, the loss. The years I couldn't get back, but something inside me had settled. Vindication doesn't always look like standing over your enemy. Sometimes it's standing beside your father's grave with nothing left to prove. Sometimes it's realizing you never needed to win. You just needed to stop apologizing for who you've always been. The letter Harper left behind sat on my desk for a week, still, sealed, still untouched. I would glance at it sometimes between meetings, or at night when the house got too quiet and grief crept in around the edges like fog. There was a time in my life when I would have torn it open the moment it was in my hands, desperate for some final word, some buried apology, or even another cruel jab that at least meant she was thinking of me. But not anymore. I'd grown past the need for her voice to shape mine. So on a Wednesday morning, just before dawn, I lit a small fire in the old stone fireplace. The letter burned quickly, curling into itself in seconds. No drama, no fanfare, just paper and ash. Her words never touched me, and for the first time in my life, I felt untouched by her. Clean. Free. That same day, I made the announcement Bennett & Co. would be restructuring, not for profit, not for press, but for people. We'd start with the board, diversifying leadership, adding real worker representation, and implementing ethics oversight that couldn't be bypassed by charm or nepotism. Bonuses would be capped, salaries made transparent. I issued back pay to teams who'd been undercompensated for years and rehired a few quiet heroes who'd been forced out under Harper's rule. It wasn't a revolution. It was restoration. And people noticed. Small business blogs called it bold. Some old guard shareholders called it reckless. But the ones who mattered, the workers, the vendors, the people who'd quietly held this company together while Harper made it her kingdom, they began to believe again. Not in me. In themselves. A month later, I stood at the front of the building during the unveiling of a new foundation, the R.T. Bennett Legacy Fund. It was designed to offer grants to young women in business, especially the ones who didn't fit the mold, the ones who wore thrift store shoes to boardrooms and spoke softly but carried entire ideas inside them. I didn't speak long, just a few words. My father made mistakes, I said. But he also made a choice in the end. He gave a daughter, like me, the quiet one, the overlooked one, a chance, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure other women get that same chance, earlier, easier, without having to fight for their worth. The applause was warm, not explosive, just steady, like something settling into place. Afterward, I walked the halls of the building alone, passing by offices that once felt foreign. I looked out the window to where the city stretched wide and humming, and I saw the reflection of myself in the glass, older now, wiser, still scarred, but no longer small, and I realized something. Revenge had never been the end game. Not really. It wasn't about watching Harper lose. It was about reclaiming what was mine all along. Not the company, not the house, not even the legacy. Myself. My voice. My place. I left the office late that night, stepping out into the clean air, the kind that follows a storm. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was carrying anything. I just walked forward. Lighter. Stronger. The right daughter, at last, not because he finally saw me, but because I finally saw myself.